Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies and to the launch of the first edition of a new IISS publication, the Armed Conflict Survey. Joining me on a panel today to answer your questions are Ben Barry, James Hackett, Virginia Comolli, Jens Wardner, Antonio Sampaio, and Alia Brahimi. This new IISS product is based partly on the material accumulated throughout the year in the Armed Conflict database, a subscription online product that has, since 2003, monitored armed conflicts around the world with a particular focus on the human security implications of these conflicts. The Armed Conflict Database is used as a research tool by governments, armed forces, media, academic institutions, and international organizations, including the World Bank, which uses the database to help it determine whether a state of armed conflict formally exists within a given country. The Armed Conflict Survey currently provides detailed coverage of 42 armed conflicts around the world, civil wars, insurgencies, and other forms of violent unrest, from a military, political, and humanitarian perspective, illustrated by maps, tables, and charts. These include the 2015 Chart of Conflict, which from now on will be incorporated within the Armed Conflict Survey rather than, as in the past, the military balance, and which this year has as its leitmotif the issue of population displacement. At the end of the publication are some explanatory notes setting out our methodologies for determining the reliability and accuracy of key statistics, such as casualty numbers, internally displaced persons, and refugees. In addition to analyzing the strategic implications of a year's worth of data on specific conflicts, the Armed Conflict Survey also seeks to add further value by looking at some of the wider trends in global armed conflicts and reflecting on the changing character of conflict. To this end, the Armed Conflict Survey contains an editor's introduction looking at the evolution of the role of armed conflict in statecraft, together with specialist essays by world-class experts, one of whom, Dr. Alia Brahimi, we are fortunate to have on our panel today, on the subjects of countering hybrid warfare, the evolution of global jihadism, crime and conflict, preventing displacement in armed conflict, and peace operations and the responsibility to protect. If we look at the chart of conflict, we see a swathe across the middle of the globe running from Central America through northern, central, and East Africa, the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula, and South Asia, that is affected by different forms of armed conflicts. This should not perhaps surprise us. These are areas that are both populous, and of course conflict happens where people are, but also in the main characterized by poor levels of economic development and weak institutions of governance. The drivers of conflict are a complex mix of the local, national, and transnational. Ideology plays a significant role, but so too does organized crime, either as a cause or as a significant byproduct of conflict. And while the drivers for the majority of the conflicts covered are internal, some are a function of a wider regional geopolitical contention. And now, with the crisis in Ukraine, the threat of state-on-state conflict is re-emerging. Perhaps the most telling graphic in the entire Armed Conflict Survey is the one showing that in 2008 there were 63 armed conflicts taking place around the world, giving rise to a total of 56,000 fatalities, whereas in 2014 there were only 42 armed conflicts, but producing a total of 180,000 fatalities. The number of armed conflicts around the world has been progressively declining since the Armed Conflict Database was launched, and this is obviously something to be welcomed. But the decline in the number of conflicts has been more than compensated for by an inexorable rise in the intensity of violence associated with them. And of course, the impact of conflict cannot simply be judged by the number of fatalities and injuries to which it gives rise. The conflicts being covered are generating ever higher levels of refugees and internally displaced persons, leading the UN High Commission for Refugees to observe that 2013 was the first year since the end of the Second World War when the global number of displaced persons had exceeded 50 million. It is civilian populations that continue to pay the price of conflicts, both in terms of short-term dislocation, but also in respect of longer-term impacts resulting from the collapse of government services, in particular education and healthcare, and economic opportunities foregone, blighting the prospects of future generations. The World Bank has estimated that 1.5 billion people, roughly one-fifth of humanity, are affected by some form of violence or insecurity. Since 2011, Syria has been engulfed in a complex civil war pitting Bashar Assad's Alawite regime with support from Russia, Iran, and Iran's proxy Hezbollah against a range of opposition groups, most prominent among which were the Al-Qaeda affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, ISIS, both of which have been the targets of airstrikes by a US-led coalition. Efforts to secure a peace deal have made no progress, nor was it possible to refer the Assad regime, widely accused of using barrel bombs and chlorine gas against civilian targets, to the International Criminal Court. Thus far, the Syrian conflict has resulted in 200,000 deaths, 70,000 of which occurred in 2014, and 3.4 million refugees, of which 1.4 million fled to neighboring states in 2014. The Syrian conflict has become inextricably linked to that taking place in the Sunni heartland of Iraq, where in mid-2014, ISIS, a jihadist group originally affiliated with al-Qaeda that had exploited Sunni dissatisfaction with the sectarian policies of the al-Maliki government, occupied Mosul and seemed on the verge of advancing to Baghdad. Having seized large swathes of territory and resources contiguous with substantial base areas in Syria, the leader of IISS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared a caliphate, putting him on a collision course with the al-Qaeda leadership. The ISIS advance was accompanied by acts of spectacular brutality, resulting in 18,000 deaths and 2 million internally displaced persons. In August 2014, a US-led coalition began air attacks against ISIS, while, on the ground, resistance to ISIS was largely in the hands of Shia militias, with significant inputs from Iranian special forces, and with the land war being coordinated by Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force Commander General Qasem Soleimani. The ISIS advance on Baghdad has been stemmed, with ISIS being driven out of Kurdish areas. But the movement continues to control significant territory and resources, has attracted a substantial number of foreign fighters to its cause, and remains a potent force in defining the evolution of global jihadism. Jihadism has also played a substantial role in Libya, where two separate governments and parliaments vied for control of a rapidly disintegrating country. and in Mali, where over the course of 2014, the Malian army withdrew from the main northern towns in that country, allowing jihadist organizations to regroup there. Jihadist violence has also led to deterioration of security in the Sinai Peninsula, where the IISS-affiliated jihadist group Ansar Beit al-Maqdis continued to engage the Egyptian military. Jihadist violence also migrated to the Delta region, Cairo and Alexandria. Meanwhile, Yemen continued its slow disintegration as the Shia Houthi rebels, who had captured an increasing number of provinces during 2014, eventually occupied the capital, Sana'a, in September last year. The Houthis faced resistance from a Saudi-led coalition, but also engaged in clashes with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which itself occupied substantial territory in the south of the country. Conflict in Israel-Palestine reached its deadliest level since the 1967 Six-Day War, following the collapse of the peace process in April 2014. Violence escalated in June, leading to the 50-day Operation Protective Edge, which resulted in substantial casualties and was followed by a rise in militant attacks in the West Bank and Jerusalem, leading to speculation about the start of a possible third intifada. The Central African Republic continued to experience high levels of violence and population displacement as Muslim Seleka rebels clashed with the predominantly Christian anti-Balaka militias amid inconclusive efforts by a new interim government to establish a peace process and the establishment in September 2014 of a UN peacekeeping mission, MINUSCA. The Democratic Republic of Congo, despite still having 54 armed groups operating in its eastern regions, experienced reduced levels of violence during 2014, with no repetition of the 2013 UN-supported operation that resulted in the demise of the M23 movement. Some 3 million Congolese have been displaced as a result of conflict, half of them children. Nigeria continued to be afflicted by high levels of criminality in the Delta region, but with no sign of a return to insurgent activity. The Islamist group Boko Haram was, however, responsible for significant levels of violence in the north of the country, including the April 2014 abduction of 276 schoolgirls in Chibok. This incident focused global attention on Boko Haram, putting pressure on the Nigerian government to orchestrate a more effective national and regional response. But throughout 2014, Boko Haram continued to gain territory, occupy towns and cities in northern Nigeria, and expand into Cameroon, Niger, and Chad. Despite receiving offers of military and intelligence support from numerous foreign governments, the response of Nigeria's military remained reactive and heavy-handed. In Somalia, the Islamist Al-Shabaab movement continued to suffer setbacks, with some of its leaders being killed in US drone strikes and coordinated ground offensives that drove the movement out of many towns and cities. Al-Shabaab, however, continued to launch attacks against Somali security forces and undertook numerous attacks in Kenya, along the Swahili coast, and in Nairobi. South Sudan came close to the brink of an all-out civil war between political rivals divided broadly on tribal lines. Repeated efforts to achieve a political solution and meaningful ceasefire were inconclusive, and repeated clashes led to substantial casualties and the displacement of 1.5 million civilians. In Darfur, sporadic talks between the government and rebel groups yielded no results, while violence escalated as pro-government Janjaweed militias increased their operations, attacking numerous villages, pillaging and raping. The Sudanese government continued to put pressure on the international humanitarian effort in Sudan, including the expulsion of a number of senior UN aid officials. Although some parts of South Asia continued to suffer significant levels of violence, the overall picture somewhat improved. The establishment of a national unity government in Afghanistan after a disputed presidential election, the signing of a bilateral security agreement with the United States, and a status of forces agreement with NATO set the conditions for a greater period of stability. The Afghan Taliban showed no interest in reconciliation and was responsible for some of the highest levels of violence in the preceding 13 years. Nevertheless, the group was unable to consolidate territorial gains in the face of sustained and effective Afghan National Army and police resistance. Afghanistan still faces formidable security, economic, and governance problems. However, dire forecasts that the 2014 drawdown of NATO ISAF troops would inevitably lead to a Taliban military victory are a long way from being realized. In India, an Naxalite insurgency that not so long ago seemed likely to take over substantial swathes of the north of the country appears to have been successfully contained, with a significant increase in the number of guerrillas surrendering to government forces and a corresponding reduction in territorial gains. By contrast, the security situation in Assam deteriorated to the point where at the end of 2014 the Indian Army was obliged to launch a major assault against the National Democratic Front of Bodoland Songbijit. India's other border conflicts have all registered a continuing decline in levels of violence. But in Kashmir, progress towards a negotiated peace remained elusive, with artillery exchanges taking place between Indian and Pakistani forces and two major terrorist attacks on Indian army bases. Levels of armed conflict in the Asia-Pacific region remained relatively low. China, however, experienced an increase in terrorist attacks by Uyghur separatists, not just in Xinjiang, but also in locations as Kunming in southwest China, resulting in some 400 fatalities, mainly civilians. China's response was twofold: an aggressive, hard security response, strike hard, and an emphasis on ambitious economic development plans, one belt, one road. Neither seems likely to address the causes of instability in China's strategically critical western border region. Although conflict continued at a medium intensity in Myanmar's eastern and northern border regions, a peace process between Naypyidaw and the majority of Myanmar's armed ethnic minority groups registered significant progress until the end of 2014, when an increase in armed clashes was registered. A nationwide ceasefire agreement appeared to be within touching distance. In Rakhine State, the Rohingya minority was the victim of several instances of mob violence. The Philippine government signed a comprehensive agreement on Bangsamoro in March 2014. This accord allows for a greater degree of autonomy and income from natural resources than in previous negotiations, and it requires the Moro Islamic Liberation Front to disarm. The accord faced some opposition in the Philippine Congress, and an MILF splinter group, the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, continued fighting for an independent Muslim state. Meanwhile, the Philippine security forces continued operations against the Abu Sayyaf group, some of whose members declared allegiance to IISS. Southern Thailand continued to suffer violence from separatist groups on an almost daily basis. Drive-by shootings and remotely detonated improvised explosive devices resulted in some 350 deaths. Thailand's military government sought to renew peace talks, engaging all the main insurgent groups, with Malaysia playing the role of facilitator. Both the insurgents and Thai security forces have been accused of carrying out atrocities. The Europe and Eurasia region was dominated by the conflict in eastern Ukraine. after separatists captured portions of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in April 2014, the Ukrainian military launched a counter-offensive. The conflict escalated throughout the summer as Russia increased its assistance to the separatists. A ceasefire was negotiated in Minsk in September, but violence persisted, albeit at lower levels of intensity. By the end of 2014, 4,700 were dead and 1 million displaced. Bombings in Odessa and Kharkiv, areas well outside separatist control, signaled the potential for instability to spread to other regions of Ukraine. Beyond Ukraine, the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh was the subject of increased tensions, with a level of armed clashes and casualties not seen for many years. In Russia's North Caucasus region, the Caucasus Emirate jihadi group struggled to reorganize under a new leader as Russian security forces intensified their counter-terrorism operations. Although its operational capacity appeared much diminished, the jihadi group carried out a complex assault in Grozny, the regional capital of Chechnya, in December 2014. Central Asian states, meanwhile, faced threats from their own radicalized citizens returning from jihad in the Middle East. In Latin America, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador continued to suffer from significant levels of violence from criminal gangs involved in the narcotics trade. Levels of homicides actually declined somewhat in Honduras and Guatemala during 2014, as the respective governments introduced new security responses with an enhanced military component. But in El Salvador, a truce between the main criminal gangs, Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, which had contributed to a marked decline in violence, collapsed. Faced with continuing instability, an increasing number of families in all three countries sent unaccompanied minors to the United States, some 70,000 of whom were detained at the US southern borders. In Colombia, peace talks with the main insurgent group, the FARC, continued, with the FARC announcing a unilateral ceasefire, a move not reciprocated by the Colombian government. Despite the ceasefire, insurgent violence continued, mainly in the form of attacks on oil pipelines and electricity pylons. Criminal groups, so-called Bakrim, however, continued to pose a significant threat to peace and security. Mexico continued to suffer high levels of violence from criminal gangs associated with the narcotics trade. In September 2014, following the murder of 43 students in Iguala, Mexico's 1,800 municipal police forces, many of which had been corrupted by the narcotics gangs, were closed down and their personnel integrated into a national force. A national gendarmerie, originally planned at 40,000 strong, but in fact comprising just 5,000, began operations. However, the Mexican state continued to rely heavily on its armed forces to deal with the criminal gangs. Violence in Mexico remains unevenly distributed, with almost 70% of the violence concentrated in just 10 states situated along the main drug trafficking routes to the United States. So, in conclusion, the picture for 2014 is mixed. Some intractable conflicts, Colombia, the Philippines, appeared to be on the way to resolution. In other cases, notably that of Afghanistan, there were tantalizing signs of hope of improvement, even as levels of violence continued unabated. But large swathes of the Arab world were affected by chronic violence and instability, with the phenomenon of jihadism providing a powerful accelerant and with little prospect of immediate resolution. Humanitarian responses to conflict were in the main effective, though resource constraints, limitations on access, and harassment by some regimes had an adverse impact. Peacekeeping operations were also in the main effective, with encouraging signs that in some regions, notably sub-Saharan Africa, regional powers were both more willing and more able to exercise decisive impact. Humanitarian intervention by Western states is currently at a low ebb, and it remains to be seen whether better economic circumstances and a progressive distancing from the memories of Afghanistan and Iraq will result in greater enthusiasm for such operations, or indeed whether newly emergent powers will develop any more enthusiasm for such activities. However matters turn out, IISS will continue with its mission of charting and analysing the evolution of conflict. To that end, we hope the Armed Conflict Survey will quickly establish itself as an indispensable tool for researchers and policymakers alike. I would now turn the floor to you for questions and comments from our panel. Yes, gentlemen in the second row there, could you please tell us who you are when you address your question, and to the extent possible who you want to address it to.
Dominic Dudley, a freelance journalist. My question is about the Middle East. To what extent are the Gulf countries fueling conflicts around the wider Middle East region in terms of providing finance or fighters or weaponry or anything else, and how do you see that playing out in the future?
Okay. Alia, do you feel equal to taking that one on?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that the Gulf countries, I think what's happening in Syria is actually indicative of the implication of some Gulf countries in the wider dynamics in the Middle East. Because after the rapprochement between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the other Gulf GCC states, we saw rebel unity and among the Syrian opposition and a massive push, which has resulted in significant gains for the Syrian opposition around Homs, Hama, Aleppo, and now in Idlib too, and moving towards the Alawi stronghold in Latakia. So I think that definitely in Syria, Gulf countries are implicated, and their renewed push for unity on the political level has had a dramatic effect on the battlefield. But I think that, as has been noted by other commentators, perhaps the agents that some Gulf countries may or may not be supporting in this wider conflict are not long-term bedfellows for the Gulf states, for obvious reasons, and mainly around, Sunni radicalization. So I think, it's a dangerous game, it's a delicate game, and I think that hopefully, sometime soon there's going to be a sense of moving back from dealing with these issues in a proxy way and looking at dealing with the fundamental political issues underlying them. Because there is this notion that political issues can be solved militarily and through proxies that I think is fueling a lot of the instability that we're seeing in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and beyond.
I think if I could, yes. Yeah, please go ahead.
Just to add a little bit more on that, on the sort of conventional military side, really. I think one of the things we noticed in the military balance, which launched, February, earlier this year, was that there's military activity by Gulf states themselves, which has taken place episodically since 2011, really. Use of conventional military force illustrates, I think, a growing readiness to use force to fulfill national security priorities. That's exemplified by the operations against ISIS. It's been seen in Libya and also recently in Yemen. And of course, these regional states, as Milbal and I think the IISS tracks, continue to procure a wide range of advanced capability conventional military systems. Now, while activity tends to be nested within US-led coalitions, particularly when they deliver niche capabilities that these states don't have, such as combat search and rescue and things like that, where they're not fully developed, I think the fact remains as growing strategic extraversion on the part of these states, and it's unlikely, I think, that will diminish anytime soon.
Thank you very much. If I can just add briefly to that, I think that when all this started, a number of these countries found themselves engaging with a number of different groups. which presented different faces to different interlocutors, and themselves evolved, changed, morphed as time went on. So I think in a number of cases, Gulf states started out supporting groups that eventually turned into something very different from what they had initially been, but by that stage it was sometimes hard to disengage, and that I think has been a conditioning factor. Next question, yes.
Richard Orton Taylor, The Guardian. Could I ask about the implications for the West? Have the West and Europe in particular appreciated the dangers? Are they interested, are the European governments and public interested in the dangers of conflicts, mainly miles away? And in particular, with the EU getting more introverted, the possibility of Britain leaving, basically the West interest and Europe in particular in these conflicts.
Thank you, Richard. Anybody want to fall on their sword on that one? Ben?
Well, Richard, we have a toxic inheritance in many European and Western countries of the problematic wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, where the price in blood and treasure, many of the population, politicians and media judge was, not politically justified in retrospect. That's also been combined with the reductions in defence spending following the 2008 financial crisis. Now, you have seen European countries modestly reverse this with increases in defence spending in the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Germany and latterly France. And I think that's driven by two factors. One is the Ukraine crisis and a sense of vulnerability, particularly for NATO's frontline states, against potential future Russian mischief making. The other thing that seems to have driven the increase in defence spending in France is a significant uptick in the involvement in armed forces in peacetime security, which seems to have been the main driver. I do, like you, have a sense that the EU's introversion as a result of the Eurozone crisis has limited its strategic ambition. In a sense, the war weariness from Iraq and Afghanistan and that have reinforced each other. But I think the migrant crisis across the Mediterranean has acted as a potential wake-up call. And I would echo the sentiments of the UK's International Development Secretary, Justine Greening, that actually this crisis demonstrates the importance of tackling this sort of instability at root cause, using all the tools of government power, not just military, but also economic development.
Okay, thank you. James?
Just to sort of follow up on what Ben said there, I mean, yes, there might be some introversion on the part of the EU given economic challenges, but I think there hasn't been much introversion in terms of the EU's security engagement abroad. I mean, if you look at the long-term rule of law justice missions that the EU is still pursuing, these are things that actually are quite difficult in terms of delivering short-term objectives, but are designed to try and bolster the stability and of states moving forward. And the UK is involved in a lot of these, by posting personnel to these relatively small-scale but enduring missions. Other European states that are concerned with conflict, France, look at what it did in the last few years with Operation Barkhane, rolling in a number of the missions across the Sahel to produce a more coordinated, fair enough, counter-terrorism-driven mission, but again that has security stabilization and defense capacity building as a key objective. Now, on defense capacity building, when nations provide that, I think one of the key things moving forward for states to consider is how to nest that into broader state stability. Because as I've bored colleagues with in the past, there's not much point strengthening an armed force if you don't strengthen the treasury so that the troops are paid on time. It's all part of a whole. And I think in some respects the EU's activities are quite clever in the way that they try and bolster state stability as well as economic stability in states. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman right at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. Ali Bahaji of North-South Publications. I was wondering about the talks taking place at the moment in Morocco about the Libyan parties there What do you expect will be the outcome? And if the outcome is actually negative, how bad will it be, or will it get in Libya? And not only with its porous borders, but also with the immigration. Thank you.
Okay, well, that takes us somewhat outside, the terms of this particular exercise. Ali, I don't know whether you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, so to try and, route it back to the notion of armed conflict, I think that this presents at the moment, the talks at the moment, they feel like a last chance now to try and roll back what is happening in Libya, because the dynamics within the Libya Dawn, but also the Tobruk bloc, are changing, and they're changing every day. And if you look at what the Islamic State is planning to do, particularly to try and offset any reverses it may be experiencing in Iraq and Syria, it definitely has its sights set on Libya. And you can see that not just on social media, but the fact that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has sent his deputy, Abu Nabil al-Anbari, and Turki al-Binali, Bahraini firebrand preacher. They've been sent to Libya to prepare the ground. They're going to try and co-opt and infiltrate pre-existing groups in Libya, and there's very much a plan. There's very much the idea that Libya is the next staging ground. And I think the only way, as everywhere, to isolate the Islamic State and to prevent them from gaining a foothold is through a political settlement. And at the moment, what is happening, the talks that are happening, feel like a last chance for that. So hopefully, hopefully they will succeed, and then that might be vindication also for the Algerian model, which is that all of these conflicts, including Mali, require a political solution.
Thank you very much, Alia. Yes, third row here on my left. We'll get to everybody.
Richard Green with CNN. Anyone brave enough to try to predict the effect on conflict of the collapse of oil prices, the likely generational change in leadership in Saudi, and the remote possibility of a nuclear deal with Iran?
Well, this takes us an awful long way outside
Go on, be brave.
terms of engagement. I would simply observe that the collapse in oil prices is actually starting slowly to reverse itself. So, as so often with energy markets, these things are not only not forever, but they're often not for very long. And we're starting to see oil bouncing back. The Saudi generation. Ben, you want to say something on this?
It has had two effects on the complex conflict that we see in Syria and Iraq, with ISIS at the centre of it. One is the reduction in oil prices will not have done any good for ISIS's oil smuggling operation, which of course also has received some attrition from non-military lines of action in the coalition. And that clearly an important node in it was what the US Special Forces raid at the weekend was designed to attack. But secondly, it's also done no good for the Iraqi government finances.
I was going to say that all of the factors that you pointed to are actually in some ways part of the story with the Yemen war. So the immediate response would be that these three factors are actually part of the catalyzing of a brand new armed conflict in Yemen, or at least the internationalization of it, and the notion that Saudi Arabia feels that it has to be at the front line of the battlefield now to take its destiny into its own hands. Now, we may see a walk back from that, especially after the Camp David summit with Obama, but certainly those three elements actually sparked a whole new conflict which wouldn't otherwise have escalated in that way in the absence of those things.
Yep, thank you very much. Gentlemen, third row on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam Nussi from the Japanese newspaper Nikkei. Regarding, I've got a question about boat people in Southeast Asia, not only the Rohingya but other groups as well. Are the numbers of people being displaced in the region at historically high levels? And is that situation likely to worsen as countries in the region continue to refuse to accept these people? Thanks.
Jens, can you pick
Yeah.
up that one, please?
Well, in fact, it's not a new issue. Well, we have again seen a large number of migrants traveling by boat this year. But the UN has estimated there has been about 120,000 of these people over the past 3 years. And I think security forces in many countries exacerbate these problems, either pushing boats back or in some cases being complicit in or maybe even profiting from human trafficking. And the current Thai crackdown, after they found the graves of several Rohingyas in the forest on the border with Malaysia, may have made things worse, as people smugglers do not dare take the refugees closer to land, and so they're stuck in the middle of the ocean. I don't see a comprehensive regional solution on the horizon. For one reason is that Myanmar, where the Rohingyas, many of the Rohingyas come from, they also leave from Bangladesh. It's difficult to know who comes from where. But Myanmar refuses to discuss this issue, an internal issue, it says, in a multilateral setting.
Okay, thank you very much, Jens. So somebody in the first row, and then Mary Jideski after that.
Kim Sen-Gupta from the Independent. Can I ask then, in an answer to a previous question, I think it was Richard, you used the phrase toxic inheritance, Ben. Would you say Libya is now a toxic inheritance? And going on from that, what do you think this new EU military, semi-military mission is going to achieve? Are we really going to see operations on the ground in Libya?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Well, quite clearly, the plans that were made during the Libyan war to help Libya stabilise itself and reconstruct itself and put it on a proper, inclusive political path, and those, considerable effort was put into making those plans by the US, UK, France, and a number of Gulf states and regional powers. Quite clear those plans didn't work. And of course, they were conditioned by this toxic inheritance of Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of no presence of Western boots on the ground. But we are where we are. With regard to the potential EU military mission, without a UN Security Council resolution for the use of force against smugglers' boats and if necessary against smugglers, it's difficult to see that any European nation will have the appetite to use force. Whether Russia and China can be persuaded to support that in the Security Council is an open issue. But I think it's very important that the human traffickers, we shouldn't just focus on that manifestation, which is the boats full of people. It's the whole network from the country of origin. And I think EU Foreign Policy Chief Mogherini was very clear on this. It's got to be a comprehensive attack throughout the length and the breadth of the business model of the human traffickers that actually will degrade their networks. And I think she's right on that.
Okay, Virginia.
If I could just add one sentence on this. I totally agree that the EU should do as much as they can to disrupt the business model of the traffickers and really make it very hard or even impossible for them to continue with their business. However, we need to be realistic that even if this is going to happen and if there is this UN Security Council resolution approving this, the impact is going to be fairly limited because it doesn't really tackle the root causes, the reasons, the drivers that force the people who are the migrants to leave their countries. So I think this will only cure, if successful, the symptoms, but certainly not the cause of the problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, Mary, there. Just the second row, please. Yeah, thank you.
Mary Dejevsky, freelance. Why do you think that the term hybrid warfare is useful, and why do you use it exclusively in relation to Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Gosh, who wants to kick off the batting on hybrid warfare? Yeah, Ben. Yeah, it's got to be you.
There's nothing new about war where symmetric elements, state-on-state elements, are combined with special forces or irregular elements. Examples of this are the American War of Independence, the Peninsular War, Vietnam War, and actually you see elements of it in the coalition-led war in Iraq in the previous decade. But it's very useful for showing that this hybrid war is more than this, and it poses a comprehensive challenge to the state on the receiving end of it. It also, I think, shows that the response needs to be comprehensive. It can't just be military, it's also got to be political, economic, and intelligence.
If I could just also add something.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think at IISS we have debated the use of the term hybrid quite a lot, not just with regard to warfare and conflict, but more broadly in the context of hybrid instability. And I think this label, and of course we always have to be careful before putting labels onto things, but I think it's quite useful to describe conflicts such as the one in Mali, for instance, where you see a combination or a convergence among different elements, so the ideologically motivated, the financially motivated, and you see insurgency-type activities taking place alongside criminal activities, taking place alongside terrorist activities. And so I think the term hybrid really helps us describe something, or a context in which all these things take place at the same time in the same theater of operation, and as it was just been said, therefore require a combined approach, for instance, that puts together counterinsurgency with counterterrorism, with counter-narcotics. I'm not saying that is easy to be achieved, but certainly something to be borne in mind.
Okay, James, yeah.
Yeah, we had a piece in Millbell on this earlier in the year. And the ACS piece usefully traces the sort of the heritage of the idea, really, and the use of regular and irregular forces. I think what we noticed earlier in the year in terms of Ukraine is that what we're seeing is the sort of synchronized and rapid integration of regular, irregular capabilities, cyber information operations, EW. It's that sort of coordination and juxtaposition that I think is interesting in the Ukraine case. I mean, how do you then respond? I mean, there are military responses that we talked about in the military balance in terms of, look at what NATO is trying to do in terms of boosting the NATO response force, etc. But military responses are only one part of it. They could include cyber, IO, strategic communications, savvy social media operators, and expertise from other government departments. And these capabilities, I think, can help in developing monitoring and anticipatory capacities. Now, that might include ISR and combat intelligence trades, people able to say, what a particular piece of military equipment is on the ground at a particular date and time. But it might include more nuanced skills, such as those held by linguists. It might include civilian as well as military skills, anthropologists, and a network, federated networks of experts. So retaining personnel with these sort of capabilities can allow better understanding of a security environment in fragile regions or potential actual adversary states. The problem with those sort of capacities is, unlike military equipment, it's hard to see a tangible result. If you maintain a capacity that forestalls a crisis, how do you deliver an output if you're a policymaker? So that's why it's important to maybe look at a federated suite of capabilities, because that doesn't have to be held on the books, basically. And the bottom line is ever more important. But those sort of broad network of anticipatory and monitoring capacities that give you as much forewarning as you can get, I think it's really vital moving forward.
Thank you very much, James. Okay, the lady in the third row there, please. Yep, in the blue top. Yep. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Joyce Sohadra. I'm from TVC News. It's a Pan-African news channel. My question is about Boko Haram, and what the area of the amount of displacement there is in that part of the country, northern Nigeria, and also about the challenges that are faced in that part of the country, in that part of the world, and what governments and policymakers should be doing about that.
You've come to the right place. We've got one of the top experts in the world on this subject, Virginia.
Thank you, Nigel. I'll buy your coffee later. Well, I think the Boko Haram conflict has produced a huge amount of displacement. Approximately 1.5 million people have been displaced by the conflict, and about 15,000 people have been killed. Of course, it's hard to give you an exact figure, but that's the rough estimate that we have, alongside now thousands of people who have been kidnapped in the course of the conflict. Finding solutions, of course, that's the hard part. And as Boko Haram is involved in attacks in Chad, in Niger, and Cameroon, it has become more and more clear that a regional approach is needed to counter Boko Haram. Of course, some of these regional initiatives have already been implemented with some success, I would say, particularly thanks to the involvement of the Cameroonian and Chadian forces that have been able to stop the advance of Boko Haram in their territories. Certainly, I think over the past few months, the Nigerian forces have produced quite a lot of results in terms of recapturing many towns that fallen under the control of Boko Haram, and really forcing Boko Haram to hide in the Sambisa forest. So I think, of course, many would argue that this success has been made possible by the use of mercenaries who have been flown in from South Africa and Eastern European countries, and that's, of course, in itself is a very controversial issue that would require an whole event just to discuss it. How sustainable that is, I'm not entirely sure. Whether when President Buhari takes office at the end of the month, I'm not sure whether he would like to keep these to keep the mercenaries in place. Certainly now Boko Haram's capabilities have been much reduced compared to what they were last year, but certainly Boko Haram is not a spent force, and it requires that the military forces keep on putting pressure on Boko Haram. However, I would say that an exclusively military solution is not the one that is going to bring long-lasting peace and stability to Nigeria, to northern Nigeria. And I think that unless programs aimed at economic rejuvenation of the Northeast, programs aimed at improving the educational system and increasing political participation of the Northeast at the federal level, I think lots of the grievances that currently fuel the insurgency and make it easier for Boko Haram to recruit members will still be there.
Thank you very much. Right, the gentleman right at the back there in the far corner. Yeah, there. Keep your hand up, please. Thank you.
And Juan Carlos Bejarano from RCN Television Colombia. From your introduction, Mr. Inkster, I gather that you and IISS think that the peace talks in Colombia will end with signing a peace agreement. Although the Colombian conflict is probably the longest in the world, 50 years of fighting, when you talk to people back in Colombia, most people still think that the best solution is trying to defeat FARC and to abandon this peace process. Is it possible to defeat FARC militarily? Do you think that this peace process will end with a peace agreement?
I think if you look at the totality of insurgencies, it's quite hard to draw conclusions. Some can be defeated militarily. Most, however, require some sort of political solution. Having said that, I'll turn over to Antonio to give you a more detailed exegesis.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. the peace talks have been made possible in great part by the weakening of the FARC during the past 15 years, with an increased military campaign by President Uribe and then President Santos. So the weakening of the FARC has led to these peace talks. However, the FARC has responded to the increased military campaign by a process of decentralization, of fragmentation of its units that are now more able to implement attacks by themselves. They don't depend so much on the central leadership. So there is a response by the insurgency to the counterinsurgency measures, to the increased capacity of the Colombian state. So the defeat of the FARC, I think, would not be, something that would be achieved very easily. So I think this realization has paved the way for the government to start the third large-scale attempt of a peace talks in 50 years of conflict. However, the ELN is now the main element, the main question for the coming years, because it's not currently yet talking with the government. And if the ELN doesn't engage very quickly in a peace process with the government, there is vast room for demobilized guerrillas or guerrillas that don't want to engage in the reintegration process with the government to find this alternative to continue fighting and to maintain its control of illegal economies, illegal mining, and transnational drug trafficking.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Okay, I've got, I have three more. I'm going to take them all together and then I'm going to draw it to a close because otherwise we'll run out of time. We'll start with the lady at the back and work our way forward. If you could keep your hands up till I can see you. Thank you. So I'll get to you.
Nina Harballu from Al Jazeera Arabic. You've spoken in chapter 1 about the evolution of global jihadism. How do you see it affecting the conflicts that are already in the Middle East?
Oh yeah, this has got to be yours.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, it sort of cuts both ways. I think that what we've seen is that armed conflict itself has fundamentally changed the nature of jihadism, so that you now see jihadism as a state-building enterprise, which is fundamentally new. And I think that's going to be the biggest impact on, in turn, conflicts that are already going on. As a result of insurgency, invasion and occupation, state violence after the Arab Spring, in Syria and Iraq mainly, we've seen a massive shift in the nature of jihadism, which is now being exported. So the model that is being adopted everywhere, in many places now, from Baghlan province in Afghanistan to Borno state in Nigeria, is to seize and hold territory and to impose a vision for society. Now that fundamentally changes jihadist spaces, ideas, and actors. In terms of spaces, you see jihadist spaces geographically expanding, as outlined in the survey, but also systematically deepening, because the Islamic State isn't just exploiting chaos, it's seeking to impose a long-term order. And that will have a significant effect on conflict, is the fact that they are deepening their presence within geographical spaces. And in terms of ideas, in order to control local population, you have to continually instill fear. And so as a result, we've seen an ever more fanatical discourse where mass casualty attacks against civilians is now presented as just self-evidently justified. So this is a huge shift from the days of bin Laden. And in terms of actors, we have the foreign fighter problem, where upwards of 3,500 Western nationals are in Syria and Iraq, people from 70 different countries fighting there, and a lot of the times beyond the reach of the security services. So the picture has fundamentally been changed by armed conflict, and it will also change certain armed conflicts, because the Islamic State will seek to gain inroads where it can in conflicts around the world, and engage in this process of state building, which offers the prospect of increased resilience vis-a-vis the Al-Qaeda that we used to know.
Alia, thank you very much. Gentleman in the middle there, please. Yep. Thank you. Yeah. Just one microphone will do.
Yeah. Thanks. Robert Wall with the Wall Street Journal. I had two quick ones. One on The level of violence in Iraq, given what we've seen in the last few weeks, really, what do you think the prospects are that this year Iraq could turn out to be deadlier than Syria? And then just totally unrelated, I'm just kind of wondering what the trend line you're seeing about violence in Waziristan.
Okay, right. Who wants to go first on Iraq? Ben?
I think what we have seen in Iraq is that the great blitz attack that ISIS did last year had, broadly speaking, been contained both by the coalition airstrikes, but also, just as importantly, by the mass mobilization of Shia militia. The ambitious plans that the Iraqi government announced to clear Tikrit, to clear Anbar, and then to clear Mosul and have it all done within the year, quite clearly the counterattack in Ramadi demonstrates that ISIS still can counterattack at the tactical and the operational level, and it can seize the initiative. Indeed, it's displaying tactics of quite a high order, and it's showing elements of the operational art, which on that front line has locally overmatched the Iraqi government forces. My prediction is this seesawing, this to and froing for the near future will continue. I think it unlikely that the number of deaths in Iraq will exceed the number of deaths in Syria, even though, as other panelists have said, the strategic circumstances appear to have altered in Syria, with the Turks, the Qataris and the Saudis being much more organised about their support to the anti-government elements.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to say something? No?
I was just going to say that the structural problems in Iraq are still there. They haven't been dealt with, and they're actually exacerbated by the agents that are seeking to reclaim territory from the Islamic State, who allow you maybe to take a step forward on the battlefields, but perhaps two back in the larger war. So in the absence of dealing with structural problems, which are ultimately about Sunni disenfranchisement and having a wider political settlement among the Sunni population, I think that you're going to have this back and forth, and the fundamental problems will remain undealt with.
On Waziristan, I think I'd just say that it's quite clear to us now that the Pakistani military have concluded that the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, does constitute a potentially existential threat to the stability of the state. And we have witnessed over the last couple of years a fairly sustained and determined effort to deal with it. I think some of the other actors that are located in Waziristan, the Haqqani network, as we saw last year when the Pakistani military moved into North Waziristan, I think it's fair to say that they gave the Haqqanis a bit of a head start. And as far as I'm aware, the only building left standing in Miram Shah is actually the Haqqani Network's compound and mosque. But I think the likelihood is obviously that violence in that region will continue. But it now looks as if the Pakistani armed forces are determined to maintain order there. And of course, the global focus of jihad, as we know, is somewhat shifting, which it's not clear, I think, at this stage exactly how that will play out. And it's actually one of the issues, the whole question of stability, violence, the role of jihadism in South Asia, which we are now starting to turn our attention to, because there are a lot of unanswered questions about that. Right, gentlemen in the second row there, and then I think we'll have to call a halt.
Hi, Yasuo Naito, the Japanese Sankei News. My question is about China. You mentioned about Uyghur separatist movement, but well, there are no fatalities at the moment, but South China Sea, we observed the island building measures by China, and it seems that it's kind of worrying things. And what is your view on these issues? Thank you.
Okay. I'll probably do that one myself, if that's okay, unless anyone else wants to particularly pick up. I think what we've seen up until now in the South China Sea, and to a lesser extent perhaps the East China Sea, is what looks like a fairly carefully calibrated set of activities by China to, in effect, create facts on the ground that support and reinforce China's claims and China's case. It's noteworthy that most of the activity in the areas concerned are being conducted by paramilitary forces, not military forces. So it's not the PLA Navy that is primarily engaged. It is fisheries protection, Coast Guard, these kinds of activities. Of course, we're seeing the construction of the so-called Great Wall of Sand, the expansion of existing islands and the turning of some reefs into islands. I think that is part of a carefully calibrated strategy, as I said, to create facts on the ground. My sense is that the Chinese government, the Chinese state, believes that this is a manageable and sustainable strategy, that the risks of escalation, which clearly do exist, are largely manageable. And we've actually seen that when China has come up against something that looks like either an immovable obstacle or something that could prove escalatory, that they have resiled, withheld further activity. But in every case, I would interpret that only as a tactical pause, not a strategic retreat. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We've run out of time, and I apologize if anyone wasn't able to answer questions, but our experts should be, to varying degrees, available to deal with questions one-on-one. Can I please ask you to thank the panel for their responses?